The band King Crimson is, of course, one of the most revered in progressive rock. They were one of the first prog rock bands to have massive success with their debut album, 1969's In the Court of the Crimson King. But they've made themselves a band that is very hard for new listeners especially to get their arms around. King Crimson, in its original incarnation, went through a multitude of lineup changes between the band's inception in 1968 and their collapse in late 1974. They would reform, of course, 6.5 years later in 1981, but that version of the band was relatively short-lived also, dissolving in late 1984. The band would then regroup in 1994 and last for about 3 years before breaking up into subgroups in what Robert Fripp referred to as a fractalization of the band into individual projects, before reconvening on a smaller scale in 2000 and lasting another 3 years until dissolving again in 2003 for about another 11 or 12 years before they would yet again resurface. Broadcast radio, beyond King Crimson's first album, never really embraced this band, at least not in the United States. Even the band's classic tracks from their first album, 21st Century Schizoid Man and In the Court of the Crimson King, are very rarely played on broadcast radio in the States today. And satellite radio really is not much more accommodating to progressive rock either. Sirius XM radio in particular has very little coverage of the prog rock genre. They cover it on their Deep Tracks station only occasionally, and as I'm making this episode, Stephen Wilson's broadcast on the genre is occurring on only a monthly basis. So there really are very few places where a new listener can hear this music on an informed basis. I'm hoping with this episode that I can help remedy that situation for new listeners who are interested in exploring this band. In this episode, I'm going to talk briefly about the 3 King Crimson albums that I think provide the best introduction of the band for people who are interested in hearing what this band has to offer and to help them make a decision on whether they want to continue exploring the band's other music. With King Crimson, I think the best place to start is at the beginning with their debut album. In the Court of the Crimson King is a masterpiece of its time frame. In retrospect, it's probably a bit flawed in spots. I think in particular, the psychedelic track on the album Moonchild probably could have benefited from some judicious editing. I don't think it needed to be 12 minutes long. But that being said, there is some wonderful music on In the Court of the Crimson King. The album, of course, opens with 21st Century Schizoid Man, a track which, in October of 1969, when the album first came out, was unlike anything else in the rock and roll genre. If anything, the middle section of the song sounded more like jazz fusion, except that in 1969, jazz fusion was just barely beginning to make a mark for itself in the marketplace. Miles Davis's album In a Silent Way, which is often considered to be the very first jazz fusion album, had only come out in July of '69, 3 months before In the Court of the Crimson King. In fact, King Crimson were recording In the Court of the Crimson King at the time Miles's album came out, so it's doubtful that In a Silent Way had any direct influence on what King Crimson were doing in the studio. King Crimson's debut is very notable because of the diversity of music, the pure variety of what appears on the album. 21st Century Schizoid Man is followed on side 1 of the original LP configuration by I Talk to the Wind, a delicate ballad that Ian MacDonald and Pete Sinfield had originally written for Ian MacDonald's then girlfriend, who was also a member of the band, Judy Dybel to sing. This was prior to Greg Lake's joining the band as bassist and vocalist. And of course, the album features the two beautiful hymn-like pieces, Epitaph and the title song, The Court of the Crimson King, which feature Ian MacDonald playing the mellotron, in some cases overdubbing the instrument massively to create a pure orchestral feeling to the music at hand. One thing that's particularly notable over and above the music in The Court of the Crimson King is that the album was self-produced. Most rock bands in 1969 weren't given the opportunity to produce themselves, and almost certainly not for a debut album. King Crimson's ability to create the lush sounds that they did on this album with a relatively small amount of experience behind a recording console was no small feat. The three primary producers on the album, Robert Fripp, Greg Lake, and Ian MacDonald, did a wonderful job of bringing this music to light. The album remains, at least in my opinion, a classic today. If you can only pick one King Crimson album to listen to, this should be the one. But there are two others that I think are very noteworthy that someone who really wants to explore the band should hear as well. The first of those two other albums is the album Red, from October of 1974. By the time Red was made, King Crimson had gone through a host of personnel changes. Distinctly different bands making their third studio album, Lizard, and their fourth, Islands, before getting to the early part of 1973 with a band that was very distinctly inspired by European-style classical music as well as jazz. This version of the band featured Bill Bruford, the original drummer from Yes, on drums, and John Wetton, then effectively an unknown, although he had appeared with Family and Mogul Thrash for brief periods of time prior to joining King Crimson, on bass and on lead voice. This version of the band, which also initially featured the violinist and keyboardist David Cross and the percussionist Jamie Muir, would make 3 studio albums together and 1 live album. Of the 3 studio albums, however, the one that most crystallizes this band's sound is the album Red. Interestingly, Red is structured in much the same way as King Crimson's debut is, as far as the pacing of the selections on the album are concerned. Like the debut album, Red contains 5 songs. Like the first album, the first of those songs, Red, is a powerhouse, very hard rock inspired in style. The second song on the album, again like the first album, is a ballad, a beautiful one that features John Wetton's voice and a significant amount of the songwriting as well, called Fallen Angel. This is a song that John Wetton would revisit later in his solo career and would also perform in his band Asia, going forward several years from when Red was made in 1974. Fallen Angel is followed on the album by the hard rock track One More Red Nightmare, a great piece written by Fripp and Wetton that also features the saxophonists Ian MacDonald and Mel Collins joining in. That is followed by a live improvisation called Providence, taken from the band's 1974 tour prior to Red being recorded. This track also includes David Cross on violin, who was let go from the band just before Red was recorded. And then finally, there is King Crimson's masterpiece, Starless. I've discussed Starless at length in another episode on this channel, so I won't go into too much depth here other than to say this is a song that over the course of its 12 minutes runs the gamut of emotions. It begins as a ballad from the pen of John Wetton, and it transitions at about the 4-minute or so mark into an intricate piece in 13/8 and ultimately 13/16 meter, featuring the band going through an exercise in light and shade, starting with very soft dynamics and ending with fuzz tone bass and distorted guitars, as well as alto and soprano saxophone solos from MacDonald and from Collins again. This is a song that has to be heard to be believed. By the time Red was released to the general public in October 1974, this version of King Crimson had broken up. It would not be until the early portion of 1981 before King Crimson, in a new lineup, would reemerge. Robert Fripp would rejoin forces with drummer Bill Bruford, but taking on two new players, both Americans, the first time in King Crimson's history where American musicians would play with the band. Tony Levin, who had worked previously with Robert Fripp on Peter Gabriel's albums as well as on Robert Fripp's first solo album, Exposure, came on board playing bass and Chapman stick. On vocals and guitar, Adrian Belew was part of this band as well. Belew was an intriguing vocalist and lyricist whose style owed a bit of a debt both to the Beatles on one hand and to David Byrne and Talking Heads on another. Belew, of course, had worked with Talking Heads on their Remain in Light album, as well as with their touring outfit that supported that album, which recorded half of the album. The name of this band is Talking Heads, also in the 1981 timeframe. Belew also was a terrific guitar player. This would be the first time that Robert Fripp would share the spotlight on guitar within King Crimson of any real note. There were occasional times in the studio for recordings where Greg Lake and John Wetton had also provided guitar support. But the vast majority of the guitar work that had previously been heard on King Crimson's albums up until 1981 came from Robert Fripp. With Adrian Belew on board, Fripp had a guitar player that he could trade licks with and do some very interesting things, both stylistically and from a performance perspective, that he would not have been able to do on his own. And Fripp and the band took full advantage of this. Belew, as the primary lyricist for this version of King Crimson, would take the band down some interesting paths. Belew was capable of writing songs that could by turns be very beautiful, as was the case in Mata Kudasai. They could be very quirky, as was the case with Elephant Talk and with Indiscipline. And they could be experimental, both in terms of their structure and their lyrics. The songs Frame by Frame and Thela Hanjinjit are early examples of what has since come to be known as math rock, where Fripp and Belew approach the song using a polyrhythmic approach, where the two players are often playing in different meters, only coming together occasionally, but making the content of the song more dramatic as a result of that approach. There isn't a bad song on Discipline. The two that I haven't mentioned, the two full-blown instrumentals, The Sheltering Sky and the title track, Discipline, are very well worth hearing as well. The Sheltering Sky in particular was always a highlight of this band's live performances. The studio version of the song goes on for over 8 minutes, and the live versions would often go on for far longer than that. The 1980s version of King Crimson, of course, was the version that was celebrated recently by Adrian Belew and Tony Levin, with assistance from Steve Vai and Danny Carey, on their 2024 tour under the band name Beat, that, of course, being the name of the second album that this version of King Crimson would put out in 1982. All three of the albums made by this incarnation of King Crimson, Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair, would be featured by Beat on stage. But the album that got the greatest amount of attention in the sets that that band would perform over the course of that tour was the Discipline album. And it deserved it, quite frankly. I was at two of the band shows in the New Jersey and Philadelphia area when they passed through here in September and October of 2024. And let me tell you, It was a wonderful experience. It felt like I was reliving shows from 45 years before. Anyway, those are my three choices. In the Court of the Crimson King, as a sentimental favorite that is such a keystone of the genre that anyone who calls themselves a progressive rock fan must hear it, and I would say must have a copy in their collection. Red from 1974, I think, belongs in a serious collection as well, if for no other reason for the songs Red and Starless, but really the entire album is very, very well crafted. And finally, Discipline started a brand new chapter with Ballou and with Levin on board, taking the band into uncharted territory in a number of different ways that was, at least in my opinion, just right for the early 1980s. One commentator from that time frame referred to the 1980s version of Crimson as the most technically perfect band in existence. I would be inclined to agree. That grouping of musicians is one of the finest in not just progressive rock history, but rock and roll history in general. So those are my three picks. I don't know that everyone will agree. I'm sure that there are fans of King Crimson who are watching this video who will want to give a shout out to various others of the band's albums. And indeed, I don't think there really was ever a bad King Crimson studio album in the course of the band's history. By all means, if you have comments that you'd like to share about other King Crimson albums, or if you would like to disagree on some of the points I've made here about these three albums, feel free to use the comments here and share them, and let's talk. If you like the episode, of course, please press like. If you're not yet a subscriber to Progpaganda, of course, please join us. We'll be back very soon with another episode on prog rock, both ancient and modern. You take good care. Bye-bye.